Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whichever part of the world you are joining in today. I'm Anjan Chakraborty, and welcome to the Independent Talk. The Independent Talk series seeks to chronicle the lives of independent journalists around the world. It focuses on their professional lives, their success, their learnings, the challenges they faced in their journey as an independent journalist, as well as their bits of failures that they had in their journey. Once we get to know about their stories, their journey into independent journalism, we learn a lot about independent journalism as a career path and how one should go about it. Without any more delay, let me introduce you to our guest today, Paul Mooney. Paul is an American freelance journalist who has reported on Vietnam, Burma, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong since 1985. He has been on the staff at Reuters, Newsweek, the Far Eastern Economic Review, Eastern Express, the South China Morning Post, and Night Reader Financial News. His articles have appeared in Asiaweek, International Herald Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, Boston Globe, Washington Post, Asian Wall Street Journal, and many others. A recipient of 14 awards for his reporting on China, Paul was based in Beijing from 1994 to 2012. Paul returned to the United States in 2021 after living in Hanoi for close to 3 years and continues to write about Asia. Welcome, Paul, to the Independent Talk series, and I thank you for making time to share with us your story, your journey as a journalist, and more specifically as an independent journalist for the last 35 years. Now, before we start our session with Paul, let me set the ground rules for this talk show. So I'll have few questions for Paul first. And yes, I'm the host, so I get to go at Paul first. And as Paul shares his journey, if you have any questions for Paul, please send them in the chat room, and I will pick those questions at the end of Paul's talk, and I'll ask Paul those questions on your behalf. Thank you, Paul. Thank you once again for doing this and making time to share your journey with us. So I'll begin by asking you, how did your journey begin? How did your journey as a journalist, and how did your journey to basically go around all parts of Asia, primarily China, Burma, Taiwan, how did all that begin? And what are the kind of stories that brought you the biggest satisfaction as a journalist while covering Asia? And can you share us that journey with us, Paul?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't intend to be a freelance or an independent journalist. It was more kind of by necessity. When I was younger, I didn't study journalism. I majored in Chinese studies, didn't have a degree, no experience. And I applied to a lot of newspapers and magazines, but with no experience, I couldn't get a job anywhere. And eventually, I was already 30 years old. A friend got me a job at Newsweek magazine in New York in the photo department. And I started as a photo filer, and then a photo researcher, then a news researcher, and then eventually worked up my way up to doing some reporting in New York. But I miss being in Asia. So in 1985, I went to graduate school, got a master's. I moved back to Taiwan, where I had been a student about a decade earlier. And I started freelancing then mainly for Newsweek. And it was quite difficult in the beginning because, again, I didn't have much experience. You know, I often wished I'd started in a small town newspaper somewhere, you know, where I could have learned the basics. So I had to learn on my own by doing. And so, but, you know, I soon kind of realized that I was more suited for freelance journalism. I like the ability to do different types of stories and different types of formats. So I've mainly been a print journalist. That's been 90% of my work, but I've done radio, I've done some TV. And so, I liked having that. And the other thing, probably more important, was that I wanted to have, I wanted to be able to do different types of stories. And I have had occasional staff jobs over the years. I never lasted very long, but each time, no matter who you're working for, you're limited to what you can do. You can only do print, or you can only do kind of, video or broadcasting, and then also, there's a lot of stories that certain publications aren't interested in. Whereas a freelancer, I could think, okay, here's a story I want to do, and who can I pitch it to? And I had the whole, basically, kind of the world, kind of that I could pitch stories to. So being a freelance journalist, kind of gave me that, and I really enjoyed that because there were so many different types of stories that I wanted to do, and I was able to take advantage of that. The downside was I never had security. There's no medical coverage, there's no holidays. My family suffered a bit as a result, but I have no regrets. I enjoyed what I did and the types of stories that I did. So I had a good career.
Yeah, I mean, you had your entire career has been on reporting on Asia,
Right?
Primarily China, and primarily Greater China. It's not just China.
Right. Sure.
Taiwan and Hong Kong as well.
Right.
Now, so I mean, you said that you had you studied in Taiwan, so I think that kind of gave you an impetus to work on the ground there, or?
Yeah, in college, I majored in East Asian studies, focused on China, Chinese language. And I graduated in 1974. The US had no relations with China. I wanted to really kind of improve my language ability. And at that time, it was either Taiwan or Singapore if you were studying Chinese. And so I went to Taiwan, and it was a good place to study Chinese. And I stayed there about 3 years, studying the language and learning. And I didn't know what I was going to do then. At that time, I thought maybe foreign service, journalism. There was no investment in China then, so there were really no business opportunities. But journalism was something that I was always kind of keen to do. And so when I eventually left Taiwan and went back to the U.S., that's when I tried to get jobs in journalism, but I couldn't. And I ended up, I was a waiter. I worked in a bookstore. I was a security guard, and then finally I got the job at Newsweek, which kind of got me going.
Okay, so that's a wonderful journey, actually. Now you spoke about, you love the freedom of freelancing because you thought you could pitch stories to various media outlets.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
right.
Pitching is something that's a very important aspect when it comes to independent journalism. And this is a question that I have received from a lot of participants, that how do you pitch your story? I mean, there is something that's particular that you keep notice of while you're pitching a story. Is there a particular format that you follow, or do you have to do enough research to pitch a story? Do you have to do a research on the media organization you are pitching a story? So how do you do that? I mean, how can you share your tips on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, things have changed dramatically. When I first started, there was no internet. And I remember sending letters from Taiwan or Hong Kong back to the US. Could take weeks to get a response, And now with the internet, a lot of the print media is gone. I worked for Asiaweek. I worked for the Far Eastern Economic Review. A lot of the publications I used to write for are gone. And so I find myself now today, and a lot of my colleagues, we're writing much more for internet-based news sites. And so I've had to kind of shift my strategy, and I do a bit of research. I watch and I see, I subscribe to a lot of different newsletters on all over Asia, and I can see what kind of organizations other people are writing for. It could be things like the Diplomat or Asia Times or Foreign Policy. It could also be a newspaper or a magazine. But a lot of what I do now is on the internet, and so. The one thing is, you have a story idea, you try to think who would be interested, who would run a story like this. It's quite difficult to pitch a story to the major, like Western media, like the New York Times or Washington Post or Times of London, because they have their own staff, and they'll take things if you have a really good story. But a lot of my career, I was a stringer. And so I was in a different country, and I was I didn't have a contract, didn't have a salary or anything, but I was the go-to person. And now I'm pretty much on my own. And so when I have an idea for a story, I try to think who might be interested. For example, I wanted to write about a Vietnamese journalist, Pham Doan Trang, who was arrested last year. And so I thought, she's in jail now, probably the top journalist in Vietnam. And so I thought, oh, a Columbia Journalism Review would be a good publication. They run stories like this. But I made a mistake, and I sent them my pitch, and I didn't hear anything back. My fault. I waited about a month, and then I thought, well, I didn't have a name. When I wrote to them, I just said, it was a website said editors. I went back and I looked at the website more closely, and I noticed they had guidelines. And so, and one of the guidelines was in the subject put pitch. And so since I hadn't done that, they completely ignored my suggestion. So I'm going to sit down and I'm going to look at what they wanted. They say how many words they want, what information they want. So for any publication, I would check first to see if they have guidelines for pitching stories, you know, and you never pitch to more than one publication at a time, because if you sell an article to one magazine or newspaper or website, they'll get quite angry if you sell it to someone else, if you've already sold it. So unless you tell them, I've done this before, so I always just do it one at a time. You give them a few days, you know, 4 or 5 days, they don't get back, I do a follow-up, don't hear, then I pitch to someone else. So, you know, so basically it's kind of like, you have to kind of learn what the market is, what are the publications that you might be able to pitch to, and then kind of looking at their website and see if they have any guidelines. If not, you know, just a general short, you don't want it too long. You don't want to give away too much. Couple paragraphs describing what your story is with the most interesting information you can give them. And that's basically how to do it. And with the internet, it's so much easier today to pitch stories.
I think that's a very important insight that you gave away. That, I mean, before pitching, you should look at whether the publication has a set of guidelines on how to pitch. So that's a very important insight, because as you said, most of the time we may not know that, and we'll just shoot an email and saying that this is my story, do you want it? But it's not in the right format, and it will never get
Sure. No, and I think a lot of editors get angry when you don't follow their guidelines, and it's automatic, you know, rejection. Doesn't mean you can't, you know, send it again in a week or a few days, you know, but it's better to get it right the first time. Yeah.
Okay, so now the second question is kind of supplementary to that pitching question that I had. So I have also heard that, you know, a lot of pitches that you send out, you may not often get a response, or sometimes you may get a response, but the response could be negative. I mean, there could be the editor saying, no, we are not interested in this story.
Right.
Or sometimes even we have heard that editors coming back and saying, we don't want the story in the way you want to tell it. We want a different aspect, different angle to it. And so there are kind of, and people face rejections all the time when it comes to your story not getting approved or accepted. How do you tackle that as an independent, or how should an independent journalist tackle such rejections?
First, I think you have to be a bit thick-skinned. You can't let it bother you. You know, you just keep trying. If one person doesn't accept, if they don't get back to you, well, that happens a lot. You just keep trying and you try again, and you make sure that you kind of look at your story suggestions. The pitch should be short, shouldn't be more than 2 paragraphs, because the editors don't have time to read. I'd also say, if they come back and say, yeah, you know, we like the idea, but how about if you kind of do it this way, you know? And if it's acceptable, yeah, accept it. Don't be too you know, kind of stubborn about this. If they're making a change you think's going to not kind of in line with what you want to do or what the story is, then don't accept it. But if you can, I usually try to work with the editors, and a lot of times you get a better story because they have expertise and they know what the readers want. So I would suggest kind of, you know, working with them and accepting, you know, but never give up. And I remember once I pitched a story to a newspaper that I was working pretty regularly for, and they said, no, we're not interested. The next day, I actually sent a pitch to the Asian Wall Street Journal. They ran it a day or two later, and I think maybe the next year I won an award for that article. So here was a story that one newspaper said, we don't want it. And maybe it wasn't their type of story. Maybe they didn't think it was relevant to the readers. I don't know. But I persisted. You know, I sent it to someone else. They ran it, and I won an award for that story. So you know, just keep trying, keep plugging away. And if you don't, certain stories, if you don't make it, then just keep trying, you know. And another thing I found also, and I used to meet with a lot of freelancers in Asia that were passing through, and I'd always say, you know, a lot of people say, oh, I have 10 different ideas. I have these 5 stories I want to do. And some of these people, I would never hear from them again. Maybe 10%, 6 months later, I'd see them and they were, but I always say to them, pick that one, if you of your 5 or 10 ideas, pick the one that you're really most excited about and get it done. And what I found was, like, many people spend a whole year juggling 3 or 4 ideas and never actually writing a word. So the key thing is, like, get something done. And I also would say also, I never write a story before I get somebody saying they want it. I don't want to waste the time. You know, some people, you can do it. If you think you have a really good story, you can. I might have done it 2 or 3 times in 30 years, you know, but normally I don't write until somebody tells me that they want it and they agree with the way I've suggested it.
Okay, so I mean, I think the story about your particular story getting an award, I mean, that's kind of a inspiration, because you never know who is going to pick up your story. You never know
Right.
who's going to approve. So you keep trying, and eventually if your story has the quality that you want to tell,
Right.
you will eventually find an outlet that is going to give voice to that story. So
yes. If you have a good idea, yeah.
never
Sure.
stop trying. And the other insight is focus on one story that you believe in. I mean, that's another.
Right.
Not with too many ideas, and as you said, not end up writing any of them.
Right. Yeah. Get something done. Get one done.
Yeah. So that's.
And I would also say that I'm often juggling 3 or 4 stories myself. You know, because I have different ideas and I'm waiting to interview somebody, but I'll always get one done, and then before I actually move on to doing the real work on another one. But I often have a dozen. I keep a list of story ideas that I want to get to eventually, and I put little notes on who I want to speak to. So I keep kind of a record that I keep going back to, so I don't forget what is the source, what is the person, what's the book or article that I want to read about that. You know, so but you know, especially when you're starting, when you get more experience, you can kind of do a couple of things at the same time. But just to get, you need to build up a portfolio, because a lot of times people are going to say, what did you write before? And so it's getting those first 2 or 3 articles published is the hard part. And then once you do that, and with the internet today, other people will notice it. And I found that I think maybe 30-40% of my work over the years came from people finding me online, you know, seeing what I'd written. So, you know, just do it, get something done, you know.
Okay, that's a great insight, Paul. Thank you for that. So the one part of the journey of an independent journalist is finding a story, finding a media outlet who is going to accept that story, and then getting it. While you also have to handle rejection on that part. So that's one part of the challenge. Now, there are other challenges for an independent journalist on the ground, like wherever you're based in, you're reporting, you may be in a different country, a different culture, and you don't have the security of, you may not always be working for a mainstream media publication. You contract with them. So there are lots of other challenges that you face on the ground. So how should one go about it? How should one tackle those kind of challenges? Can you share your experience?
Yeah. I mean, this is a problem, and I don't know if I have a good answer, because I often, you know, I did a lot of stories that were sensitive, especially in China, traveling around the countryside, going into rural areas. I went into AIDS villages, cancer villages, you know, areas of Xinjiang where the government didn't want me, you know, and because I was freelancer, maybe the publication would have helped me, but I doubt it. I always felt I was on my own, you know. But you know, what I did a lot was, I mean, you have to protect yourself. I always told my wife, you know, where I was going. I kept in touch with her, you know, with somebody. I sometimes I traveled with other journalists. I did stories together with other journalists. We traveled together. If you have 2 people, it's a lot safer, you know. But you know, I covered the 1989 crackdown in China. And I was writing for several publications, but didn't work for any. And you know, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of there. I didn't know how I was going to pay my hotel bills, you know. And it was a bit kind of harrowing. I was a bit worried, you know. But when you're a freelancer, this is one thing you have to take into account, is that if there's some danger, you may be in a kind of a vulnerable position, So all I can say is that I kept in touch with my family and with friends, and so people always knew where I was. And if I thought there was any danger, then I would let people know, so that if they didn't hear from me, then they knew there was some problem. And the other thing is that like I was the last time I was detained in China in 2017 by the police, and I was able to call my wife on my mobile phone. They didn't stop me, and I told her to call the embassy. So all embassies will keep an eye out for will kind of help their citizens. So the embassy was kind of monitoring, calling my wife back and forth. So no matter what country you're from, you should have the numbers of different departments in the embassies where you work. So that, or have your family know, or if your wife or girlfriend or boyfriend, and have them contact as soon as something happens, because they can go to bat for you. So.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good insight into how one should go about a job, especially in a different country.
Right.
Now, my last question to you is, and you said this earlier as well, I mean, there is not always financial security
Right.
when it comes to the job of an independent journalist, and you don't have health insurance and stuff like that. So there is always a kind of
Right.
that question mark on, are you going to make enough money? Are you going
Right.
to your family
Right.
pay bills for your family? Are you going to earn
Right.
enough? So
Right.
how do you think, I mean, from your experience as an independent journalist, how should one manage the finances, and how do
Right.
you think one can be secured? And can you share your insights, your learnings?
Yeah. It can be difficult, and for me it was difficult because I had two children, and so I had to put them through school. I had to pay rent, and and my wife, and so it wasn't just myself. If you're by yourself, it's a lot easier. In the early days, the first couple of years I was working, and even pretty much later on in my career, I also did a bit of other type of work. I translate from Chinese into English. So I would take on translation projects. I did some editing for companies. So whenever I wasn't making enough from my journalism, I would look for some type of side work, either editing or translating or writing reports maybe for someone, and so that's how I wrote some guidebooks. I wrote travel books. I wrote about a dozen travel books, in Taiwan and China. I looked for other ways to supplement my income. By the time I was established, there were times when I made much more money than I hoped I ever expected to make. So if you once you get in and people know you and you have a lot of sources to pitch to, and you have to hustle. I mean, one of the things when I first started, it would take me like 10 days to write a short story, and by the time I kind of left Asia, I could do 3 in a day. And so I was, and the interesting thing was that the word rate I was getting in Asia in 1985 was about was about 25 cents to 50 cents a word. In like 2017 or 18, it was still around that amount. So there'd been no increase in the amount. Now, of course, if you write, there's a difference. If you're writing for business publications, economics, you'll make a lot more money. My problem was that I wrote about politics, social justice, human rights, and the business publications have a lot more money. They pay a lot. So I didn't want to do business journalism, but I did some of it to supplement the income so I could do what I wanted to, sort of like an actor who's a waiter, in between movies, but once I got established, I had enough work to keep me going. But I hustled. I worked 7 days a week. I worked, I used to joke that I was the James Brown of freelance journalism, the hardest working man in show business. And I was constantly like juggling stories and talking to people and doing interviews and stuff. And even when I went on vacation with my family, we went to Bali or went to Malaysia, I was like, okay, what can I write while I'm on vacation? And my kids would get up late, and I was up at 6 o'clock writing some story that I had in my notebooks so that I could hang out with them when they woke up. So I never had any breaks or any vacations or anything. So you have, if this is what you want to do, you're prepared to make that commitment. And I think it's also good to, I'd probably advise most people freelance for a year or two until and see if you can find a better job, find something that's good, that's what you want to do, that's paying, and you have benefits. It's better in the long run. If you don't want to do it, if you're a dedicated freelancer, that's fine too. You'll succeed, I think, if you have the drive.
Okay, so basically, I mean, the insight that I can draw from your story is that journalism may not pay all your bills, so you will have to find to diversify yourself and probably do some translation work or other write reports.
Right, you're editing, writing reports, yeah,
stuff like that. And also the other insight is this is also a good learning for those who want to start out independent journalism or who are already doing independent journalism. The insight from Paul is that business publications usually pay a lot more than political general news reporting. So if you can sometimes supplement your earning by doing some kind of business journalism, do it. You may not have the passion for it, but you're just doing it for the sake of earning.
Right.
You focus on the main area of work later, but you can sometimes do business journalism as well. So that's
right.
Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Those were my questions, and thank you for those lovely earnings that I got from you. I have now some questions from participants.
Okay.
I have got these questions. I'll go one by one. Okay, and I think this was an obvious question that would come. I had thought that somebody would ask this question because you have worked so many years in China.
Right.
So this is a question from Ashish. He wants to know. I mean, we all know about media censorship in China.
Right.
And you worked a long time in China. So you must have faced that kind of censorship, especially being a foreign journalist. So how did you cope with that kind of censorship?
Yeah, I worked in China and I worked in Taiwan and did a little bit of work in Vietnam. And there's no real censorship for foreign journalists, but there's more intimidation and harassment. So I mean, I never had I was in Taiwan in the early '80s. Mid 80s when it was not much different from China in terms of media, and I remember getting called in after I wrote stories and being criticized by the Taipei's government information office under the KMT in the old days, so I mean, nobody ever tried to block a story. In the old days, I was sending things out by telex and then faxes and then internet, and so nobody in China or Taiwan, or Vietnam ever stopped me from sending anything out. Also, that when I was in Taiwan and I was in China, I was always accredited as a foreign correspondent. And that's very important if you're working in another country that requires it. Like Hong Kong didn't require it, but kind of dictatorships, require that. And so I was the entire 18 years, I was a legal, accredited journalist in China. So, I got visits from the police. I wasn't allowed to go places. I was stopped from meeting people. I was harassed. I was intimidated. I was detained. But nobody could have. So I never faced the problem of censorship. It was always hanging on the back of my mind, though. Am I going to get into trouble for doing this story or that story? And eventually I was forced to leave China. The government didn't give a reason, but I assume it was because of the writing I did on human rights and social justice issues. But my own philosophy was that if I can't write about what I consider as news, then there's no reason to be here. Yeah. I shouldn't be here writing about things that I don't care about. So it was a risk I took, and I lasted 18 years. I had a good run. So, it's even in China, it wasn't, in the old days at least, it's changed in recent years. It wasn't common for a foreign journalist to be kicked out. Again, if you came and you didn't have accreditation, then it was, people like that were kicked out all the time, and you got blacklisted. So I didn't really deal with censorship as a foreign correspondent.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Ashish, I hope that answers your question. The next question comes from Joydeep. His question is, working in a foreign country, so you have done that for so many years. There is an important barrier to break, which is the language barrier. Now, since you said that you had studied in Asia and you had studied the language, it must have been easier. So it is important for a journalist who wishes to work in a different country to mandatorily learn the local language.
Definitely, it's you can't overemphasize the importance of the language. I studied Chinese quite seriously. I studied 4 years in university, 3 years in grad school, 3 years in Taiwan. I was quite serious about it. I did intensive summer programs. So when I got to Taiwan as a reporter, my speaking and reading was already fairly good. And I couldn't have done the things I did without the language ability. In all the years I was in Taiwan and in China and Hong Kong, I never once traveled with a fixer or a translator or interpreter. I did everything myself. That's one of the problems of being, a freelancer. Also, you don't have the luxury to hire somebody, usually. But knowing the language helped. And I used to, even with censorship for Chinese journalists, there was still kind of good journalism that was being done about things that the government didn't restrict. And I would buy 15 or 20 magazines every week and newspapers. And I didn't read them cover to cover, but I went through and I ripped articles out that seemed interesting to me. I watched TV news, I listened to the radio. I talked to every taxi driver, I just constantly, I was like a sponge, and from all sorts of sources. So I would talk to friends of mine who were writers and artists, but I would talk to the guys who sold DVDs on the sidewalk. I talked to the beggar, the kids who were selling flowers on the street, and so I absorbed a lot. And when it really drove home to me how important it was after I left China, I went to work in Burma, and there were riots in Mandalay. And I went up to Mandalay, and I had my Burmese, assistant with me, but it was early in the morning. I went out to walk around. There had been protests, it was martial law, and I saw things painted on the walls, and I had no idea what they meant, and it could have said buy, Drano soap, but maybe it said, down with the government. I didn't know, but I felt, and I couldn't talk to people, and it was I felt it was a big restriction, and I really kind of appreciated. And I remember I was in Xinjiang, and I saw signs on the wall which said, which banned people going on the Hajj. We called it illegal religious activity. So I always saw this. I was able to use it. I saw signs in hotels that said women cannot wear a veil, men cannot have a beard. And so without that, I would have missed a lot of these. It seems like small details, but it's the stuff that provides color and detail and kind of authority to your story. So I say, sometimes it's, you can't learn every language. I tried to learn Burmese, but I was kind of older and didn't learn as quickly, but any country I would go to. I was in Vietnam. I studied Vietnamese the whole time I was there. Didn't do much reporting in Vietnam, but I studied Vietnamese the whole time. So I think any place you go, try to learn the language.
Yeah, I think, I think 2 days back, in fact, I was speaking to a journalist friend who was in Kabul. She is an independent journalist, and she landed in Kabul on 11th of August.
Wow.
And she finally managed to, she's an Indian independent journalist.
Right.
And she managed to return to the country on 17th. So she spent about 6 days in Kabul, and she was narrating her story. Those 6 days in Kabul, when finally the Taliban took over the reins in Afghanistan, and experience. And she did not know, because the language that they speak is Pashtun. Now, she did not know Pashtun. She had knowledge of Hindi and Urdu, which is still a long way away from Pashtun. So it was difficult to on the ground talk to the women and children, talk to the family in the camp. It was difficult for her, even with a translator. So you cannot, as you said, you cannot overemphasize on the fact that if you are reporting in a different country, learning the local language is a very, very important aspect. Without that, you will miss on many finer points.
You'll miss a lot of things. Yeah. And I'd say also, if you go to a place where you don't know the language, number one, you look for a good fixer. You find somebody who's good. You ask other journalists. I know, like on Facebook, there are several pages for different countries, like for Burma fixers, or China fixers, that people that will work for the media. You have to be a bit careful that it's not some police spy or something, but you ask for recommendations from other, and you hang out with other journalists, because people that have been based there, they know the area. Some of them may know the language, or they have fixers, or they have friends. You make friends with people, and so I've kind of gotten around that. I remember even in Burma, I met people that, a lot of Burmese speak English, obviously, so. But I always look for people that I could talk to and get information from, so there's, it's not a complete handicap. It's better if you know the language, but in a lot of cases, if you parachute into someplace, there's nothing you can do about it. Then you have to make the best of the situation that you can.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think Jaydeep, hopefully that answers your question. The next question comes from Padmaja Jayaraman. Her question to you is, and she has supplementaries to that as well. So her
Okay.
question: do publications turn to you if they got any story idea for you? When do you say yes or no? If you say no, would it tamper your relationship with the publication?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, I think, probably 40% of the work I did was people coming to me, and sometimes they knew me, sometimes they didn't. But people, they'd hear, oh, you're in Beijing. Someone else told us about you, or we saw your articles online. And if it was a story that I thought was legitimate, that I wanted to do, that I could do, I would do it. But there are times when you say, like, I don't have any expertise in this area. I don't know anything about this. Or there were times when I thought the story wasn't a good story. It was, that they kind of misunderstood the situation. You say no. You be careful about saying no, because people will cut you off. So that's a good question. So I would think about it a bit before doing that. And I think in most cases I did. When people came to me, I would do the story because I always could use a little bit more work. So I was kind of happy when somebody approached me. But I seldom turn things down. But you don't take something that you don't feel comfortable doing, or that you're not going to be able to do a good job on.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I hope that answers your question, Padmaja. The next question comes from Sayantani Adhikari. Her question is, how journalism in Asian countries is different than that in Western countries?
Oh, wow, good question. Yeah, I think, well, I can say from my experience, yeah, the Asian countries I worked in, such as Taiwan and even Burma and China and Vietnam, there were a lot of restrictions on the media. If you're in the US or Europe, nobody really cares what you write about, I mean, generally speaking, unless you want something very sensitive, or people are worried about what you're writing. But in the West, you don't, I mean, in China, every single thing you did, people were like looking over your shoulder, you know. So it's a lot easier in Western country. I face a lot more restrictions, and there were places I couldn't go to. I couldn't go to Tibet, for example. I tried for 17 years to go to Tibet. You need special permission to go to Tibet, and for journalists, it's almost impossible to get. It happens every couple of years, and then Xinjiang. When I went to Xinjiang, when I was there, I'd have somebody knock on my door within 15 minutes. Because as a journalist, if you're an accredited journalist, I had what they call a J visa, J1 for kind of a journalist based in China. You check in the hotel, that's written down. It's immediately sent to the police. And so sometimes the police would show up 15 minutes later saying, what are you doing here? Who are you talking to? And they know you're there. And sometimes they would just follow you, which makes it really difficult to report in that question. But I didn't have these kind of things in the US. Nobody really seems to care a whole lot. I think one of the problems with some of the communist countries is, nobody's going to blame the government if there's a hurricane or a typhoon, or if there's AIDS, or if there's COVID, but like countries like China and Vietnam kind of tend to work in that way. Oh, we don't want anything reported because it's going to make us look bad, and in Western countries, they don't have that kind of sense. So you have a lot more freedom to work, and to write about what you want to write about. So I think that's the main thing. I just felt much freer, and I mean, by the time I left China, 18 years, I was worn out, from kind of, playing cat and mouse with police. And, and there were times when, I had colleagues and we traveled because of that passport, the visa number. We went to places we didn't want the police to know over there. I had friends who would stay in a sauna all night because you didn't have to register. You need a place to sleep, and sometimes we went into a place and left the same night and came back. You didn't want to stay overnight. So we had to be quite creative, about where we're going. Or else, there were people I had, Chinese American colleagues who would, put on some dusty old clothes and pretend to be farmers, and they could do that. I couldn't do that, but you have to be kind of creative in places like China or Vietnam, and because people are, especially showing up with a white face, people are immediately staring at you. They're suspicious, And I was doing a story once on a boatload of people that tried to escape China in Fujian province. I went down there, and I went down to the coastal area with the jumping off point, and I thought, okay, and it was a town that no foreigners ever went to, and I thought I'll just have some and because I didn't have permission to be there, I was living in Hong Kong at the time. So I went illegal. I didn't have a journalist visa from Xinhua in Hong Kong. And so I walked into a bookstore and I was going to like browse and then casually, innocently asked the bookseller some questions. And then I looked and there were 30 or 40 Chinese people outside staring in at me. So I said, oh, I can't do this. And so then I left and I went to a little restaurant. I ordered some food, and all of a sudden, like everybody in the restaurant was staring at me. I couldn't ask a single question. And then finally I walked around a bit and I walked into a barbershop, and they have, in China, you get your hair, wash, massage is like 40 minutes. I said, okay, nobody's around. I went in, it was quiet. There were two young women. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to say why I'm here. I wanted to find out if the people had been sent back, they'd been arrested or not. I'm just going to, for 15 minutes, I'm not going to say anything. Sat down in the chair. The first question was, where are you from? Oh, I'm from New York. Oh, my cousin's in New York. He just got caught in the boat, and the police took him. And for 40 minutes, my mind was racing. How do I remember everything she told me, But it was, I was lucky. I was lucky quite often and able to stumble across the right person, or, you do your homework, you prepare. But I felt a lot of times I was lucky that I would meet the right person or the right circumstance.
Yeah, I think the key that came out from your experience is that surveillance is something that's kind of constant in some of the countries in Asia. So when you are working as a journalist, you might be followed, and you might be asked a lot of questions by people, the authorities, the police. May not be the case at all when it comes to doing journalism in Europe or US.
Right.
Also, I mean, your story about this. When you were this is a wonderful story that you shared about your day when those people were trying to flee by boat, and it's a fascinating story because A, you are on the ground trying to get a story out of it, and B, your experience with that bookstore and that coffee shop and the barber shop. That's a story in itself. I mean, it's a story. Sometimes it's a story of survival. I mean, you are like there trying to capture a story about people fleeing China. Right. In the back of your mind, I mean, you are like thinking, okay, am I going to get caught? Am I going to get detained? I mean, am I going to make safety out of this place? So that is also playing in your mind. It's a constant and constant fear of maybe getting caught or getting even, I don't know, maybe harassed and detained and whatever.
It was always in the back of my mind. I mean, foreign journalists, got detained quite often. It wasn't uncommon, but I only heard of very few cases of journalists being hurt, of being beaten up or hit or anything. It was very rare. But there was always that in the back of my mind. I was always kind of worried about something like that, and like when I went to Xinjiang is the toughest place to work in China, that and Tibet, because it's such a security presence. And Xinjiang's a Muslim area. And I remember going there, and I know the cops are following me. There's people, he's always behind when I look behind me. And so I'd walk into like a photo store to get batteries for my camera. And in 5 minutes, I'd pick up some information from him, And one place I had the cops pick me up at my hotel and stay with me the entire time I was there. I couldn't talk to a single person. But then they took me to the train station the third day, put me on the train back to Urumqi. And on the train, I met 5 or 6 Uyghur students who spoke very good English, who were going back to university. It was the end of the Chinese New Year. And I managed to fill up a notebook interviewing people from Kashgar who were on the train with me. So if you're kind of like, diligent, hardworking, you can often find ways around this type of thing.
Yeah, true, very true. Thank you, Paul. The next question comes from Nazura. The question is, Mr. Paul, how do you cope with online journalism to compete in this era?
It's good and it's bad. I miss that, kind of writing for magazines and newspapers, and you'd have a hard copy in your hand with your article and your name. But on the other side, it's a lot easier to pitch stories now. There's a lot more news websites around, much more than there would have been newspapers and magazines in the past, I think. And so there's actually a good variety of organizations that you can write for. and it's a lot easier to do. It's easier to contact them and to work with them and back and forth, So I'm not discouraged. I think the one thing is I'd say that the income may not be as good as it was before. I think the websites tend to pay less than newspapers and magazines used to do, but there's certainly plenty of, and if you start looking, you'll see there's quite a few sites, and there's even a few sites that help you find work, that will you get on their list and they'll post, somebody's looking for somebody in this country or that country or for this type of thing. So there's some, definitely some sources you can use also online, and just getting information. I remember in Taiwan in the 80s, I needed a report and I'm trying to write the story and I got to file it in 2 hours. I had to jump in a taxi, go across town to some government office, get the report. And now it's like it's on the internet. You don't need to do that. And you find stuff that you never knew existed because it's on the internet. So it's become a lot easier you're not really kind of pounding the sidewalks as much as you used to. So there's good with the bad.
Yeah, okay. I hope that answers your question, Azura. The next question again comes from Sayantani Adhikari. Her question is, how challenging is it to report from conflict areas?
I'm wondering, what does she mean by challenging? Did she say?
I think what she meant was that you have reported from areas
right.
that may have hostilities on the ground, and so
right.
you go to those places to report as an independent journalist.
Yeah. No, I mean, in 1989, I covered the crackdown in Beijing. People were getting shot all around me. I didn't have accreditation then. I just came up from Hong Kong. Somebody asked me to come up and help, so I was quite nervous. I had to, I couldn't pull out a notebook because there were so many cops on the street, plainclothes. So I was using little scraps. I had little pads from the hotel, and I kept it in my back pocket. I didn't want anyone to see what I had. And I just tried to be very careful. And I stayed with other Western journalists I had a Japanese friend, so I stayed with them. If you're together, people tend to, but it's quite frightening. And I remember I stayed up the entire night. I got back to my hotel room around 6 a.m. after the police had cleared Tiananmen Square, and there were police at my hotel, and they were checking, they searched me. But I had hired a driver I knew. And when I got out of the car, I thought it might be a problem. I left my photograph, my film, and all my notes with him. And I said, come see me tomorrow. So when I got to the hotel to get my key and the cops stopped me and searched me, I didn't have anything on me. So again, you just have to be kind of, creative. And the biggest thing is trying to protect yourself. I mean, to me, that's the most important thing. So I was covering riots in Myanmar, and in another town close to Yangon, and I'm sorry, in Mandalay and outside of Yangon, and there's violence, and the police are kind of coming in. You have to really kind of watch out for yourself. Try to make sure I was always kind of looking for an exit, a way out. Kind of keeping an eye on who was in front of me. Always kind of be aware. You have to have eyes in the back of your head to kind of protect yourself, and that's the biggest thing. And the one thing that helped is that when I worked for Reuters before I was sent to Burma, they gave me hazardous duty training. So I went for a week in Thailand, and they did training on how to evade capture, what to do if you're caught, how to take care of wounds, how to, first aid. And was like, and unfortunately it's quite expensive, but there are journalist organizations that offer free courses for freelancers. You have to ask around about it. And there are, things you can find online. So I would definitely do research on how to protect oneself if you're covering, someplace like what's going on in Kabul today, or kind of any kind of a coup d'etat or riots or protests. It can be quite dangerous. And I know a half dozen journalists who've gotten killed over the last 25 or 30 years in trouble spots like that. So
yeah, exactly. And I mean, we are talking about areas of conflict, even in non-conflict areas, even in some countries. I mean, journalists get shot all the time. I mean, journalists get assassinated for
sure.
story that obviously didn't go down well with maybe a government official or the local mafia.
Right. Sure.
Even get killed for that.
Even in the U.S. now, I think it's dangerous because the people on the right have such a negative impression of the media that you're automatically suspect, and they're can be quite rough and easily provoked, So I think even in the US, with the political situation now, you have to be careful about what you're doing and where you're going.
Yeah, I think that's a very important learning that came out. I mean, it's important for journalists, I mean, to have some kind of formal training when it
Yeah,
comes to
yeah,
conflict reporting, or when it comes to going in places where your life could be in danger and you have to
sure, sure.
protect yourself. The formal training
Yeah,
is very, very
right,
important
right, right.
before you enter.
Right. Every mainstream media in the West, pretty much. I mean, Reuters, AP, AFP, New York Times, they all provide this kind of training, and it can run anywhere from 2 or 3 days to a week. And it's around the world. So it's different. And I do know there are some freelance organizations or journalist organizations that provide free or subsidized training for freelance journalists. And I wish there was more of this kind of thing. But at the very least, if you can't afford to find this, you can research. I would research this and find out, how other people have dealt and what information available. You have to protect yourself.
Right. Thank you, Paul, for those insights.
Sure.
The next question comes from Padmaja again. Her question is, human rights issue articles would require, articles on human rights issues would require relevant photographs. Have you been
Mhm.
restricted from taking photographs in Asia? How did this affect your reporting?
No, I mean, I did it depending on the situation. Sometimes I would just use a phone camera, because it's easier. And I actually went out. I had a professional camera. I always travel with a camera. I had a Canon 5D, but I was covering some news in a sensitive area, and everybody was looking at me because I had a big lens on it. And so I bought a small top end, high end kind of point and shoot. It was a good camera, but it was smaller. People don't notice that much. So but the only place I was restricted really taking photos was in Xinjiang, because they would actually come up and stop me, unless you're doing purely tourist stuff. But if it was anything like military marching on the street or a person being arrested. But I took photos. I went into Henan, was the center of the AIDS epidemic in China. I got into hospitals there. I went to protests. I went into AIDS villages. I photographed all these people, and I just did it. And it's a bit risky, but without it, yeah, you don't have a good story, for something like this. And I've done it even I did stories on asbestos danger. I went into asbestos factories, and people are dying from this disease, but I got shots of factories where people weren't wearing masks. So it's very important. But again, what I would do is, if I thought it was super sensitive, I would just carry a small camera with me. And a lot of them are good. You can, if you know photography, you can set it manually and stuff like that. But I remember, I was actually the first day at the asbestos factory. I pulled out my big camera, and the owner almost fainted when he saw it, because he didn't know I was a journalist. I was just kind of playing dumb, and asking about it. But that was when in that trip I went to Hong Kong, and I bought a small point and shoot. So it's good. And now with the phone, the quality of the phone cameras like iPhone or Samsung is so good now that you can get usable photos from using one of those. And I suggest that, because you can, and a lot of times you can just pretend you're like, and you're shooting something. I've even shot over my shoulder at times, so.
Yeah, I think I kind of remember an incident. I mean, I was in China in 2008, early 2008, and this was just before the Beijing Olympics. So the
Mhm.
Beijing Olympics was in 2008. So this was a tour organized for foreign journalists by China Daily. China Daily is
Mhm.
there, is China
Right.
state media,
Mhm.
right? It's the newspaper.
Right. Yeah.
So
Right.
they kind of organized a tour for foreign journalists in
Mm.
China just before, I think it was 4 months before the Beijing Olympics. And
Right. Right.
basically aimed, it was a propaganda basically. It was basically
Right.
aimed at showing to the world how China is preparing
Right.
for the Olympics, and how
Mm-hmm.
people who come in for the Olympics, they can enjoy the beautiful places around China and go and visit and
Uh,
probably help their tourism industry.
right. Sure. Sure. Sure.
So I was there for a week, and I was there in a group of, I think, 50 journalists from around the world who went to China for that sponsored trip by China Daily. and they took us to Fuyang. Fuyang is one of the provinces. I think
Fujian.
Fujian, yeah. So
Fujian, yeah.
there, I think they took us to an art gallery or something, and so we were taking pictures. And I think the curator of the gallery wasn't aware that that people will be taking pictures, and he just came rushing in and tried to stop everybody. Don't
right, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he was I don't know, he was worried that these pictures will go out in media and they should not be telling these stories.
Right, sure.
So
sure.
even for a state conducted
visit,
tour for journalists,
right.
I mean, we saw that people were they were trying to stop us from taking photographs.
Right.
Very
different. Yeah. I just thought of another thing about photography is that I constantly change my photo card, because there've been many cases, didn't happen to me, but it happened to friends, where the police would show up and they'd immediately take your photo card and they would delete it. They would delete all the photos on it. So I always had 4 or 5 cards on me, and I would change it every hour or so. You can't afford to lose these photos. And I remember even doing a story on a cancer village in southern China, getting into a car to head back to the city, and I immediately took out my computer. I had a device for going online, and right there in the car, I uploaded my photos and emailed them to somebody. So I was so you have to be quite creative about that type of thing too. And even and now you have cameras that have 2 slots, so you can actually kind of switch them and stuff. But it's very common now, and this was 10 years ago. It's even more common now. All the police are aware that there might be 2 slots, and so they're going to look for 2, and they're going to delete, and so of course there's software that you can use that can recover photos even if they've been deleted, so but if you're taking photos, you have to have a bunch of cards and keep switching them, and then at nighttime, or as soon as you get to the hotel or wherever, you kind of download them and put them in a couple places in the cloud so that you have backups, so that if they come and they grab you. And I even had friends who kept a fake notebook with them with scribbles, so that if the police said, "Give me your notebook," okay, here it is, but the real notebook they kept them. So you have to you become quite kind of creative in avoiding kind of this type of thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
I think that's all for the questions that I have, and I think we are right on time.
Okay.
Our 1 hour talk is concerned. So thank you, Paul. Thank you for sharing a wonderful journey of your journalism career. And I think all the people who are here, they got a lot of learning and insight.
Great.
Into how to do journalism, especially in a foreign country, how to protect yourself, how to train yourself, how to be creative in areas where you might face a lot of harassment. So those are very, very important insights from Paul. And I think we, as we learn from these experiences, we can always better ourselves as a journalist, ourselves if you want to do independent journalism. Also, it's a question of adapting to various kinds of things that's happening. Paul said, I mean, he started when there was no internet. So he had his process of journalism was very different. As he said, he would write a letter to pitch a story and then wait for days to get a response. Now it's just email. So
minutes.
Yeah, right. I mean, so things have changed, and journalists have adapted to technology. New technologies have come in. Journalists have to adapt, and so that's a very important insight as well. And all this will help eventually in making your work better. I mean, these learnings. So thank you, Paul.
Sure. Yeah. And I want to thank everybody. And the questions were all great. They were really good questions, and I enjoyed chatting with you tonight and answering the questions. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, great. All right. Have a good day. Good night.
Have a good day. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you.